All right. Hi, everybody. So today we're going over Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called Ancient Sumer. So the first thing that we really talk about in Chapter 5 is the characteristics of civilization. So if you remember a characteristic, that's a lot like an adjective. It's a word that describes something. So in order to know what something is, you have to know what it's made out of. So what is a car made out of? Well, it has a metal body usually. It's made up of tires or wheels. It has an engine and a bunch of other parts in it. There's a bunch of seats in it. There's a steering wheel. There's usually a glove box. There's all kinds of characteristics, right? So in order to know what something is, you have to know what it's made up of. We're trying to figure out what is a civilization. That's really kind of the main idea of Chapter 5, is what is a civilization? So to figure out what something is, you look at the characteristics of that. So, some characteristics of civilization. We have a stable food supply. A stable food supply. That means that you have enough food, you know where your next meal is coming from, and you can focus on other things. You don't need to focus on how am I going to feed myself and my family. If you have that, then you can have a lot of other things, a lot of other characteristics, such as a social structure. If you have a stable food supply, you know where your next meal is coming from. Not everybody has to be a farmer. You have enough food so you can start focusing on some other things. For example, maybe you'll focus on writing. You'll be a scribe and you'll write. Maybe you'll be an artisan. An artisan is a craftsperson. Maybe you'll work with metal and be a craftsperson. Maybe you'll be a merchant and you'll trade things with other cultures. There are many different aspects of social structure. However, in ancient Sumer, some examples were, at the top, there were priests, kings, and government officials. In the middle were people like farmers and artisans and merchants. And on the bottom are people like slaves. People that are slaves. So we have a social structure. We have our rich and powerful, and then we have our poor and not very powerful. To go over a stable food supply, just to quickly brush over that. In ancient Sumer, they came up with a few things to be able to help with their stable food supply, to be able to know when their next meal is coming. They created irrigation systems. We talked about that in Chapter 4. Irrigation systems. And they also created the plow. The plow really helped them be able to plant their crops, and the irrigation systems really helped bring water to those crops. So it really just transformed agriculture and made it a lot easier to grow crops, to be able to have that stable food supply. Again, once you have this stable food supply, you can move on to other things such as social structure. You can have more jobs. The next thing we have is trade. We have trade. Trade is when you buy and sell things. So merchants, they were traders. They buy and they sell things for their living. So trade. A lot of times these civilizations will trade amongst each other, and they'll get valuable resources that they wouldn't get normally. So instead of just using the resources that are available to you, for example, there's this thing called the Standard of Ur. Ur is a city-state in ancient Sumer. They built this big piece of art for this city-state. This piece of art had a thing called lapis lazuli. I believe that's spelled correctly, but I could be wrong. Anyway, they had this precious stone called lapis lazuli. And they got that from far away. So it came from far away to Ur. And it came from far away because of this trade. They were able to get this precious stone by trading with other communities. So even though they didn't have this in Ur, they were still able to create beautiful artwork using it. So they had to trade things back and forth. Government is another aspect of civilizations. So you need to have a government to have law and order so that your community and civilization isn't in complete chaos. You need to have some rules that hopefully everyone follows, but that's not always the case when it comes to kings and armies. However, we do need a general idea of how people are going to behave, what is expected of our civilization. The government in ancient Sumer were kings. And these kings were often tied to the religion of ancient Sumer. So he was also sort of a priest figure. He's also sort of a religious figure. And the king, he would give all of the people the rules. He would dictate a lot of different things about the laws, about their religion, about all sorts of different things. So he was really, again, at the top of this social structure. He had the power. He also had the money. He was the king. So that leads us to religion. Most societies, most civilizations have shared belief systems. Again, that helps keep law and order. It makes it so that everybody has a set way of believing how you should behave, how you should think, all of that. So, ancient Sumer, they did have a religion. It was a lot different than the religions we think of today. However, there are some artifacts left over that tell us that religion was very important in ancient Sumer. They had these big buildings called ziggurats. These ziggurats were built for the gods. They were these big structures that had all kinds of steps leading up to a big shrine on top. So it would be this big temple tower with all kinds of stairs. Maybe there's some stairs here too. And then there'd be a big shrine on top where they would go and pray to their gods. So they made these big ziggurats for their gods. The king and priests would go up here and they would talk about the different aspects of their religion, and they would pray that the gods would bless them. Every once in a while, they would do human sacrifice. and they would kill someone to make sure that the gods favored them. So if you sacrifice someone, maybe you'll have enough food to feed others. That's kind of how they thought of things back then. They were fairly superstitious. So sometimes, yes, they would end up killing someone in hopes that that would eventually save someone else. So it's kind of this self-sacrifice thing, which is really nice, but also really scary. So we have government, stable food supply, social structure, trade, religion, technology. So when we think of technology, we often think of like computers and cell phones. However, that's not necessarily what technology is. Technology is simply inventions that make our lives easier. They're inventions that we use for practical purposes. So, they're useful. Some technology that came out of ancient Sumer was the wheel. The wheel was perhaps the biggest invention that really helped create things like chariots. They also had plows. So they had all kinds of different things that helped them, help their lives be easier. So these wheels, they helped create carts. You no longer had to lug everything by hand. Instead, you could just put it on a cart and wheel it to wherever you want to go. The same thing with chariots. Instead of just walking, you now can get in a chariot and you can pretty much not drive, but you can drive there. You can get there without having to walk. Same thing with plows. It made their lives easier. It made it so that they were able to more easily till the land and more easily get that stable food supply. The next piece is having a highly developed written language, writing. The writing that happened in ancient Sumer, first it was pictographs. Pictographs are simply drawings or symbols that stand for objects. So, for example, if you wanted to do a pictograph of friendship, maybe you would do that. Two people holding hands. However, in writing, of course, you would just actually write the word. And it makes it a lot easier to understand what you mean. So, if you see the word friendship, you know what I mean by friendship. If you just see two stick figures looking like they're holding hands, well, that doesn't necessarily mean friendship, does it? So they made actual writing, and that made it a lot easier to understand what you were saying, and also a lot easier to get your message out. So that was there for a very long time. Instead of simply just saying something, you now have something written. You have something that you can go back to and remember. Instead of simply having to use your memory and say, oh yes, they said this. Well, no, now we have writing. So their main form of writing was cuneiform. Cuneiform. Cuneiform is writing on these clay tablets with a stylus. They're wedge-shaped styluses, and you would kind of have to hit it in order to make the impression on the clay tablets. So in order to write, you had to use this stylus on a clay tablet. You would write in cuneiform. And the last thing we have is the arts. The arts. So, Ancient Sumer was one of the first civilizations. It was also one of the first societies to really develop their culture, to develop the different art forms and the different things that make their society different from every other society. However, we all have the arts, right? We all have music, for example, like painting or drawings. They had all of these things. They had what they called a lyre in order to make music. They had, again, the standard of these beautiful pieces of art that they would create. And so all of these aspects of civilization, they all tie to ancient Sumer. That's how we know that ancient Sumer actually is a civilization. So that is chapter 5. I would make sure to go ahead and read chapter 5 just to make sure that you get all of the material. However, this is just a basic overview. So I hope you all have a good night. Let me know if you have any questions.